Good evening. Tonight we step into one of mythology's most enduring stories, the tale of how a mother's grief stopped the world and how a daughter's choice bound two realms together forever. This is the story of Demeter and Persephone, of the abduction that broke the seasons and the compromise that remade them. We'll walk with Persephone through a meadow in eternal spring, where a single narcissus draws her hand and the earth opens beneath her feet. We'll follow Demeter's desperate search, torch in hand, across a world that slowly begins to wither. We'll witness the confrontation on Olympus, the revelation in the underworld, and the covenant struck between gods that gave us autumn and winter, spring and summer. The eternal wheel of loss and return. This is also the story of Eleusis, where Demeter, disguised as an old woman, found shelter in a mortal household and nearly made a child immortal, where she taught the mysteries that would comfort generations facing death, where initiates walked the sacred way each year and witnessed something that could not be spoken, only carried in the heart. If stories like this one speak to you, myths that move slowly and honour both sorrow and resilience, a like or subscribe helps more than you might think. But I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What moved you most in this telling? Your voice shapes what comes next. Now, settle in. Let your shoulders drop, your breathing deepen. This is a story built for the long dark, careful, deliberate, designed to carry you gently toward rest. We're going to a meadow where flowers grow too beautiful, to a temple where torchlight flickers on ancient stone, to the moment when a mother and daughter embrace after the longest separation, and the earth remembers at last how to bloom. The meadow lay in the heart of the Nysian plain, a place neither entirely of one realm nor another, where the light fell differently and the air held a sweetness that was almost a hum. It was spring, the season when the earth remembers its own generosity and gives without counting the cost. Flowers spread across the grass in drifts of colour. DJ violet and crocus, rose and hyacinth. And among them Persephone moved, as one moves through water, easily, without thought, her hands gathering stems and her voice lifting now and then in wordless melody. She was young, though the gods do not age as mortals age. Youth for her was a quality of light, a particular brightness that had not yet learned shadow. Her hair was dark as turned earth after rain, and it fell loose over her shoulders, unbound, threaded here and there with blossoms she had woven into it without mirror or care. Her dress was simple, pale as milk, cinched at the waist with a cord of twisted wool, and her feet were bare. She moved among the flowers as if she belonged to them, or they to her, and the line between the two was thin as the edge of a petal. The other maidens were DJ daughters of Okeanos, nymphs who served no household but their own delight, laughed and called to one another, their voices bright as the scatter of a light on water. They filled their arms with blossoms and let them fall, filled them again, and the meadow seemed inexhaustible, a place where abundance was simply the way things were. Persephone paused and tilted her face toward the sun, feeling its warmth on her eyelids, and she thought, as she'd thought many times before, that there was nowhere she would rather be. No moment she would rather inhabit than this one, here, now, where the world was kind and the day stretched long and golden before her. Then she saw the narcissus. It was the narcissus that Gaia had coaxed from the earth at Zeus's bidding, a marvel set to ensnare a maiden. It stood apart from the others, solitary at the meadow's edge where the grass began to thin and the soil showed through in dark patches. It was taller than any flower she'd yet gathered, its stem thick and straight, its petals white as bone and folded around a centre that glowed faintly yellow, the colour of butter or early sunlight. The scent that rose from it was not the common perfume of meadow flowers, but something richer, deeper, a fragrance that seemed to carry within it the memory of things she had never known. Jade night-blooming gardens, underground streams, the cool breath of caves. She took a step toward it, then another. The laughter of her companions faded, not because they had stopped, but because her attention had narrowed, drawn to a single point as a beam of light is drawn through a lens. The narcissus swayed slightly, though there was no wind, and its scent grew stronger, almost a song, almost a voice calling her name in a language older than names. Persephone knelt and reached out her hand. Her fingers brushed the stem, closed around it, and she pulled. The earth opened. It did not crack or shatter. It unfolded, smooth and deliberate as a door opens when the latch is lifted, and from the widening gap rose a sound like the exhalation of a great beast waking from sleep, a rush of air that smelled of stone and darkness and the cold that lives beneath all warmth. The narcissus came away in her hand, roots and all, and the soil where it had stood was no longer soil but void, a blackness so absolute it seemed to drink the light. Persephone stumbled backward, the flower falling from her fingers, and she opened her mouth to call to the others, but the sound caught in her throat. The void was widening, spreading like ink through water, and from its centre something rose. First, the horses Rujay, 4 of them, black as the space between stars, their eyes bright and hard as iron, their breath steaming in the spring air. Then the chariot, low and heavy, its frame wrought from metal that did not shine but swallowed light, and standing in it, reins in hand, a figure tall and still, robed in shadow. Hades. She knew him without knowing how she knew. He was not a stranger, though she had never seen him. He was the lord of the realm beneath all realms, the keeper of the dead, the brother of Zeus and Poseidon, one of the 3 who had divided the cosmos at the world's beginning and claimed their portions. He looked at her, and his gaze was neither cruel nor kind but simply absolute, the gaze of one who has already decided and will not be turned. He didn't speak. He stepped from the chariot with a motion so smooth it seemed the air itself parted to let him pass, and he crossed the distance between them in 3 strides. Persephone tried to move, to run, but her limbs were frozen, caught in the paralysis of those who witness something too large for the body to comprehend. She felt his hand close around her wrist. Cool, firm, unyielding. And then he lifted her as easily as one lifts a child, and the world tilted and blurred. She found her voice then. She screamed. It was not a word, not a plea, only a cry, raw and bright, the sound of something torn from its place and flung into the dark. It lifted above the meadow, above the plain, and travelled on the wind to places where wind does not usually go, slipping through cracks in the day and lodging in the memory of those who heard it, or half heard it, or felt it as a shiver in the bones. The chariot turned. The horses leapt forward, not across the ground but into the void, and the earth folded back over them, smooth and silent as water closing over a stone. The meadow was whole again, flowers nodding in the breeze, grass unbroken. Only the narcissus was gone, its roots a small dark hollow in the soil, and the echo of the cry that lingered in the air like smoke after a fire has been quenched. The maidens stood frozen, their arms still full of blossoms, their faces blank with shock. One of them was Leucippe, who'd been closest. She dropped her flowers and ran to the place where Persephone had knelt. She fell to her knees and pressed her hands against the ground, as if she could push it open again, as if will alone could undo what had been done. but the earth was solid, indifferent, and when she lifted her hands they were only dirty, the soil smudged across her palms like a stain. The others gathered around her, murmuring, their voices thin and uncertain, and they looked at one another and did not know what to say, because there were no words for what they had seen. The day was still bright, the sun still warm, but the meadow had changed. It was no longer a place of safety, no longer a garden where one could move without looking over one's shoulder. It was a place where the ground could open, where the boundary between above and below was not fixed but permeable, and what had been taken could not be called back by any means they knew. They gathered the fallen flowers, DJ Persephone's flowers, the DJ, and they wove them into a wreath, clumsy and quick, and they set it on the grass where she had stood. It was all they could think to do, a small gesture against the enormity of absence, and when it was done they turned and ran, scattering like birds before a storm, each carrying the story back to the places they called home, to the rivers and springs and glades where their kin would hear and pass the word along, a whisper that would grow and spread until it reached the ears of the one who needed most to know. Demeter was walking in the hills above Eleusis when the cry reached her. She did not hear it with her ears, Wuji. It was not that kind of sound, Buji, but she felt it, a sudden cold that seized her chest and stopped her breath, a knowledge that came not from thought, but from the body, from the deep place where mothers carry their children even after those children have grown and walked away. She stopped. Her hand went to her breast, pressing against the place where the cold had lodged, and she turned in a slow circle, scanning the horizon as if she might see what had happened, as if distance were no barrier to a mother's sight. But there was nothing. The hills rolled away in gentle waves, the olive trees stood grey-green and patient, and the sky was empty of omens. Persephone, she said, and the name was a question and a summons both. No answer came. The wind stirred the grass at her feet, and a bird called somewhere in the distance, and the world went on as if nothing had changed. But Demeter knew. She knew the way one knows that a door has been left open in the night, that something has been taken, that the shape of the day has shifted and will not shift back. She began to walk, then to run, her feet sure on the uneven ground, her breath coming quick and sharp. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to move, had to search, had to find the place where her daughter had been and see with her own eyes what had been done. The miles passed beneath her feet like water, and she did not tire, because the gods do not tire as mortals tire. What drives them is not the body's strength but will, and Demeter's will was iron. By evening she had reached the Nisaean plain. The meadow lay quiet in the failing light. The flowers closed against the coming night, and the only sign that anything had happened was the wreath lying in the grass, already wilting. Demeter knelt beside it and touched the petals, Dusty, violet, crocus, rose of DG, and her fingers trembled. She lifted the wreath and held it to her face, breathing in the faint scent of crushed stems and earth, and she felt the cold in her chest deepen, spreading like frost across glass. "Where is she?" she whispered, though there was no one to answer. She stood and let the wreath fall, and she called her daughter's name once and again, and the sound echoed across the plain and faded into silence. She searched the meadow, walking its length and breadth, looking for footprints or torn cloth or any sign of struggle, but there was nothing. The earth was smooth, the grass unbroken. It was as if Persephone had simply vanished, lifted out of the world like a word erased from a tablet. Demeter's hands clenched at her sides. She felt the first stirrings of something that was not quite grief, Grief would come later. Slow and heavy but rage, bright and sharp as a blade. Someone had done this. Someone had taken her daughter, and the taking had been deliberate, planned, executed with a precision that spoke of power and intent. She did not yet know who, but she would find out. She would search every corner of the earth, every hidden place, every shadowed threshold, and she would not stop until she had her answer. She kindled a torch as the sun set, striking fire from a piece of flint she carried and feeding it with dry grass and a twist of pine. The flame caught and held, bright against the gathering dark, and she lifted it high and began to walk. She walked through the night and into the next day, and when that torch burned down she lit another, and when that one failed she lit a third. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She walked, and the torch burned, and the world turned beneath her feet. Hecate found her on the third night, at a crossroads where three paths met, and the air was thick with the scent of wild thyme. Hecate was a goddess of thresholds, of places where one realm touched another, and she moved through the world as easily as shadow moves through light. She carried her own torches, twin flames that burned without smoke, and when she stepped into the circle of Demeter's light, the two fires met and merged, and the darkness retreated a little. "I heard," Hecate said, and her voice was low and steady, the voice of one who does not waste words. "I heard the cry. It came from the Nysian plain, and it was your daughter's voice." Demeter turned to her, and in the torchlight her face was haggard, stripped of the softness that usually cloaked her divinity. "You heard. Did you see?" "I did not see," Hecate replied. "I was in my cave, in the deep places where sound travels strangely. I heard only the cry, and I came as quickly as I could. But by the time I reached the meadow, she was gone." "Gone where?" Demeter's voice was sharp, edged with desperation. "Where has she been taken?" Hecate shook her head. "I do not know, but I will walk with you, if you will have me. I will help you search, and we will find the truth." Demeter looked at her for a long moment, and something in her shoulders eased, not relief, but the small comfort of not being entirely alone. "Come then," she said. "Let us go where the torches lead." They walked together, two goddesses with fire in their hands, and they moved through lands that were familiar and lands that were strange, asking questions of those they met, nymphs and river gods, shepherds and farmers, anyone who might have seen or heard something that would point the way. But no one had answers. The nymphs wept and shook their heads. The river gods murmured sympathies and offered no counsel. The mortals looked at the torches and the stern faces and backed away, afraid of what it might mean when goddesses walked abroad with such purpose. Days passed, and then weeks, and the search took on the quality of ritual, a pattern repeated until it became a kind of prayer. Demeter did not speak of hope or despair, she simply walked, and Hecate walked beside her, and the torches burned on. At last, in the grey hour before dawn, they came to the edge of the world, where the ocean met the sky, and the Titan Helios prepared to rise in his golden chariot, and begin his daily journey across the heavens. Demeter stood on the shore and watched the first light kindle on the horizon, and she lifted her torch high. "Helios," she called, and her voice carried across the water like the cry of a gull. "All-seeing one, who crosses the sky and looks down on every hidden thing. Tell me what you have seen. Tell me where my daughter has gone." The light grew stronger, and the sun's disk lifted above the waves, and Helios himself appeared, seated in his chariot, his face bright and impassive as polished bronze. He looked down at Demeter, and in his eyes was the weariness of one who sees too much and can do too little. "Lady Demeter," he said, and his voice was warm and distant, the voice of one who speaks from a great height. I have seen what you seek to know. I saw the earth open on the Nissian plain, and I saw the Lord of the Dead rise in his chariot and take your daughter into the shadowed realm. It was not a secret to me, for I see all that passes beneath the sky. But it was done with the consent of Zeus, the cloud-gatherer, who is king of gods and arbiter of all such things. He gave his brother leave to take a bride, and Hades chose your daughter. The words fell like stones into still water, and the ripples spread and would not be stopped. Demeter's face went white, then flushed, and the torch in her hand trembled. Zeus permitted this? He did, Helios said quietly. It is a hard truth, but it is the truth. I speak it because you have asked, and because you deserve to know. But I can give you no remedy, no counsel that will undo what has been done. The dead are Hades' portion, and he does not yield them lightly, not even for a mother's grief. Demeter let the torch fall. It struck the sand and hissed. The flame quenched by the damp, and she stood in the grey light of dawn with her hands empty and her face turned toward the sun. Then the King of Heaven is complicit, she said, and her voice was low and cold, the voice of one who has passed beyond pleading into something harder. He gave his brother permission to steal my child, and he did not ask me. He did not seek my consent. He treated her as a thing to be divided, a prize to be allotted, and he thought I would accept this because he is king. She turned away from the water, and when she looked at Hecate, her eyes were dry but fierce, burning with a light that had nothing to do with torches. I will not accept it, she said. I will not go to Olympus and beg. I will not plead for what is mine by right. If Zeus thinks he can rule heaven and earth, and the spaces between without my leave, let him learn otherwise. Let the fields fall silent. Let the seed lie dormant in the ground and the harvest fail. Let men cry out to him for relief, and let him discover that the grain does not grow by his command, but by mine. Hecate did not speak, but she nodded, a single sharp motion that was agreement and witness both. Demeter lifted her hand and passed it over the land behind her, and where her shadow fell the green began to fade. The grass yellowed, and the flowers bowed their heads, and the wheat that had stood tall in the fields shivered and stopped growing, arrested in mid-reach as if the earth itself had forgotten what it was to give. The furrows that farmers had ploughed and planted lay fallow, the seed within them sleeping and refusing to wake, and the first whisper of famine began to move through the world like a cold wind before a storm. Come, Demeter said to Hecate, we will walk, and we will search, and we will wait. And if Zeus sends word, tell him I am not listening. Tell him the earth is mine, and it will yield nothing until my daughter is returned. They turned from the shore and walked back into the world. Two figures with torches that no longer burned but were carried still, symbols of a search that had become something else. Jay, a vigil, a refusal, a quiet and implacable withholding. Behind them the sun rose fully, bright and indifferent, and the day began as days do, but beneath its light the first seeds of winter were being sown, and the balance that had held since the beginning was starting slowly to break. The road to Eleusis was white with dust and narrowed where it passed between fields that smelled of threshed barley and the dryness that follows harvest. Demeter walked it as one who had forgotten purpose but not motion, her torch cold at her side, her veil drawn over hair that no longer caught the gold of the wheat chaff. The sky above was featureless, a single pale plain without bird or cloud, and the son of DJ Helios who had spoken truth. Jay, moved across it like a coin tossed and forgotten. She'd left the far places, the edges where earth met sea or mountain met sky, and turned at last toward the heart of Attica, where mortals clustered around water and the gods were spoken of in doorways. The news Helios had given her was a stone in her throat. Zeus had permitted it. The Lord of Olympus had opened his hand and let his brother take what he willed. And what he willed was her daughter, the maid whose laughter had once threaded through meadow grass like a song half remembered, now silent in a realm where no seed breaks and no spring answers. Demeter's feet carried her onward. She did not mark the distance, nor the huts of goat herds clustered where the road dipped toward a stream, nor the women who paused with amphoras balanced on their heads to watch the stranger pass. She wore the shape of grief as a cloak, and it concealed the radiance that might have stopped their breath. They saw only an old woman, tall and straight but colourless, her face turned inward, her hands empty. By midday she reached the well. It stood at the margin of the Eleusis, where the road widened and the first houses began low walls of fieldstone, roofs thatched with reed, doorways dark as the mouths of ovens. The well was old, its stone rim worn smooth by the ropes of 10 generations, and above it a plane tree spread shade that moved with the breeze like water on water. They called it Kalichoron, the place of the beautiful dance, though no one danced there now. It was the gathering place for those who carried water and those who carried news, and the women who came at evening to draw from the cool depth paused to speak of children and weather and the small turnings of mortal life. Demeter sat on the rim and let her veil fall forward, a curtain between herself and the light. Her torch lay across her knees, unlit. The well smelled of stone and moss and the sweetness of water that has never seen the sun. She did not weep. DJ. Grief had gone beyond weeping, into a stillness that was almost patience. But she sat as one waits at a threshold, neither willing to enter nor able to leave. Time passed. The shadows of the plane tree shortened, then began their slow stretch eastward. A woman came with a clay jar, glanced at the stranger, filled her vessel and left without speaking. A child ran past, chasing a hoop of bent willow, and his laughter was a bright thread quickly lost. Somewhere in the town a man was hammering bronze, and the sound was rhythmic and distant, a pulse that marked the afternoon. Then voices, higher and younger, rose at the end of the road. 4 maidens approached, moving in the easy cluster of those who have grown up side by side, their hair bound with wool the colour of saffron and their dresses cinched with linen cords. They carried bronze ewers on their hips, and their bare feet left prints in the dust. One of them, dark-haired and quick-eyed, saw the stranger first and touched her companion's arm. They slowed, curiosity pulling against the shyness that keeps the young from the old. Demeter did not lift her head, but she felt their gaze like sun through cloud. "Mother," the dark-haired girl said softly, her voice careful with the courtesy owed to age and the caution owed to strangeness. "Are you well? The day is warm. Will you take water?" Demeter let the silence rest a moment before she answered. When she spoke, her voice was low and dry as autumn leaves, scraped clean of the bright authority that moved through winds and made the barley bow. "I am well enough, child. I rest here because the road is long." The girl came closer, her friends trailing like ducklings. "Where do you journey from? We have not seen you in the Eleusis before." "From far places," Demeter said. "From lands where I am no longer welcome." One of the other maidens, fair and slight, with eyes the colour of flax flowers, leaned in and whispered something. The dark-haired girl nodded, then crouched so that she was level with the stranger's veiled face. Are you fleeing harm, mother? If you are, you may find shelter here. Eleusis does not turn away those who come in need. I fled nothing, Demeter replied, and her hands tightened on the cold shaft of the torch. What I sought was taken, and I wander because there is nowhere that holds her. The girls exchanged glances, and in them was a flicker of understanding that needed no name. Loss was a language spoken in every house, and grief required no herald. The dark-haired girl straightened. My name is Callidice, and these are my sisters Vuldige, Demo, Cleisidice, and Calitho. Our father is Celeus, who is Archon of Eleusis and keeper of the sacred law, and our mother is Metanera, who keeps the house and tends the hearth fire. If you have nowhere to go, come with us. There is work to be had and bread to share, and it is better to rest under a roof than by a well when evening comes. Demeter lifted her head a fraction, and through the veil's shadow her eyes caught the light like bronze beneath water. What work? Our mother has borne a son, late and unexpected, a child of her autumn years. She needs a nurse to hold him and keep the night watch, someone whose hands are steady and whose heart is patient. She's been searching for such a one. Perhaps the road brought you here for this. A son, a child of late blessing, cradled in hands that had not expected to cradle again. Demeter felt something shift inside the stone of her grief, not a crack, but a settling, as though a burden had found a new balance. She thought of the fire that burned in the deep places of the earth, of the seeds that slept in darkness and waited for the signal that was half promise and half command. She thought of Persephone, who had never been a mother, who had been taken before her own seasons could turn. "What is your mother's name?" she asked. "Metanera, daughter of Amphictyon." Demeter nodded slowly. "I will come." The house of Celeus stood near the heart of Eleusis, behind a courtyard where a fig tree spread branches thick with late fruit, and a cistern caught the rain from the roof tiles. It was larger than the huts Demeter had passed on the road, built of squared stone and timber, with a doorway wide enough for 2 men to pass abreast, and a threshold of marble worn smooth by years of crossing. Inside, the air was cool and dim, scented with wool and olive oil, and the faint sharpness of smoke from the hearth fire. Metanera sat in the hall, a spindle idle in her lap, her gaze distant with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has laboured long and found rest elusive. She was still handsome, though lines had gathered at the corners of her eyes, and her hair, bound in a knot at her nape, was streaked with grey. At her feet, in a woven basket lined with fleece, the infant Demophoon slept, his tiny fist curled against his chest, his breathing soft and even. Callidice led the stranger forward. "Mother, we've brought you a guest. We found her at the well, and she is skilled in the care of children. She has no home and seeks shelter." Metanera looked up, and her eyes met the stranger's Vuldige, or would have, had the veil not fallen between them. For a moment she hesitated, caught by something in the stillness of the woman before her, a gravity that seemed to press against the walls of the room. Then courtesy reasserted itself, and she rose, setting the spindle aside. "You're welcome here," she said, her voice warm but careful. "What name do you bear?" Demeter let the question hang, tasting the shape of the lie she would tell. It was not a lie born of deceit, but of necessity, a cloak drawn over truth as one draws a cloak over a flame to keep the wind from stealing it. "I am called Doso," she said. "I come from Crete, where I was taken by raiders on the wine-dark sea. I escaped when they came to port, and I have wandered since, seeking a place where my hands may be of use. The name Doso, the giver, the one who bestows." It was a thread of truth wrapped in concealment, and it held. Metanera's face softened. Then you have known sorrow, as many have, but you are safe now, and if you are willing to care for my son, you will have a place by our fire and bread from our table. She gestured toward the basket. He is my youngest, born when I thought my seasons had passed. I am not as strong as I was, and the nights are long. Will you take him into your keeping? Demeter stepped forward, and the folds of her veil fell away from her hands. They were strong hands, neither young nor old, capable and sure, and when she knelt beside the basket and looked down at the sleeping child, something in her chest, DJ clenched tight since the meadow's silence. J loosened by a hair's breadth. I will, she said. The days folded into one another like cloth into a chest, each the same as the last, yet each distinct in the small turnings of mortal time. Demeter D.J. Dosov J. moved through the house of Celius with the quietness of water, neither seeking notice nor avoiding it. She held Demophoon when he woke, rocking him in the crook of her arm and singing wordless melodies that were older than the language of men, songs that had no beginning and promised no end. She fed him goat's milk mixed with honey, drop by careful drop, and when he fretted she walked with him through the courtyard under the fig tree, her hand cupped over his head as if to shield him from the gaze of the gods. The women of the house watched her with the uncertain respect reserved for strangers who carry competence like a cloak. Metanera, grateful for the rest, asked few questions. Calidity and her sisters brought Doso water and bread, small offerings of inclusion, and did not press when the stranger spoke little. Only one among the household looked at the veiled woman with something sharper than curiosity. Her name was Iambe, and she was a servant, older than the daughters of Celius, but not yet bent by years, with a face like weathered oak, and eyes that missed nothing. She tended the hearth, and kneaded the bread, and sang bawdy songs when the men were away, and her laughter was the laughter of one who had seen too much to be shocked and too little to be satisfied. She circled Doso as a cat circles a covered dish, drawn by the scent of something hidden. On the 7th evening after Doso's arrival, as the lamps were lit and the household gathered for the evening meal, Iambe brought a cup to the stranger where she sat apart, Demophoon asleep against her shoulder. "You have not eaten with us," Iambe said, crouching so that they were eye to eye. "You take bread in your room and water from the jar, but you do not sit at table. Are we not good enough company for a woman of Crete?" Dosso looked at her, and for the first time since entering the house, the faintest flicker of something like amusement touched her mouth. "It is not the company. It is the custom. I am in mourning." "For whom?" "For one who is lost." Iambe tilted her head. "Lost or taken?" Dosso did not answer. Iambe set the cup on the floor, clay against stone, and sat back on her heels. "I knew a woman once," she said, her voice conversational, as if she were speaking of weather or the price of oil, who lost a daughter to marriage. The girl was young, barely old enough to know the weight of a distaff, and the husband was old, older than her father, with a house like a tomb and hands like roots. The mother wept for a season, and then she stopped weeping and started laughing, because what else is there to do when the gods arrange things to suit themselves and forget to ask us? Dosso's hands tightened on the child. Iambe went on, her voice lower now, almost gentle. "The mother came to me and said, 'Iambe, tell me a story that will make me forget.' And I said, 'I cannot make you forget, but I can make you remember that you are alive, and that life is ridiculous, and that even the gods trip over their own feet sometimes.'" She grinned, teeth white in the lamplight. So I told her a tale about a goddess who lost her girdle and had to beg a satyr to return it, and what she had to do to convince him. It was a filthy story, Mother, and it made her laugh until she choked, and when she was done laughing, she ate a meal and slept through the night. Dosso looked down at the cup. It was simple, unglazed, filled with barley water mixed with pennyroyal, and stirred until it was pale as morning. The drink of peasants and children, humble and honest. I do not wish to forget, she said. Then drink to remember, Yambe replied, but drink all the same. Grief is a long road, and you will walk it better fed. Dosso lifted the cup. The liquid was cool and faintly sweet, tasting of earth and the green resilience of things that grow in shade. She drank, and the barley settled in her belly like a small warm stone, and for the first time since leaving the meadow, she felt the edges of hunger retreat. Yambi watched, satisfied, and then she rose and dusted her hands on her skirt. Good. Now I'll tell you the one about the maiden and the donkey. You'll like it, ooh, Jay, there's a moral. And she did. Her voice bright and bawdy and utterly without shame, weaving a tale so absurd and so human that even Dosso, wrapped in her sorrow, felt the corner of her mouth twitch. It was not laughter, not yet, but it was the memory of laughter, and that was enough. At night, when the household slept, Dosso carried Demophoon to the hearth. The fire burned low, banked with ash to keep the coals alive until morning, and the hall was silent save for the occasional creak of timber settling and the distant call of an owl. Dosso laid the child on the hearthstones, and she knelt beside him, her veil cast back, her face illuminated by the ember glow. She had done this each night since her arrival. She anointed the child with ambrosia, the scent of it faint and sweet as apples left too long in sun, and she passed her hands over his limbs, whispering words that were not prayers but older, the language of making and unmaking that the gods spoke when the world was young. And then, when the preparations were complete, she lifted him and held him over the fire, not in the flame of never that of Dine, but in the heat that rose from it, the shimmering air that was neither smoke nor breath, but something between. She held him as one holds a fleece over a dye pot, letting the heat soak into his skin, into his small bones, burning away the mortal dross that clung to him like clay. It was not pain. The child never cried. He slept as one sleeps in a mother's arms, trusting and still, and the fire licked at the edges of his mortality and ate it thread by thread. She was weaving him into something else. Not a god-jay, she could not make a god-jay, but something close. Something that would not know the teeth of age or the slow theft of time. It was a gift born of her own loss, an answer to the question she could not ask. If I could not keep my daughter from the dark, can I at least keep this one from the same slow diminishment? On the 10th night, as she held Demophoon above the coals and murmured the words that bound heat to flesh, a sound broke the silence. A gasp, sharp and high, the intake of breath that precedes a scream. Dosso turned. Metanera stood in the doorway, her face white as limestone, her hands clutching the frame as if the world had tilted, and only the wood kept her upright. Her eyes were fixed on the child, on the fire, on the stranger who held her son above the flame like an offering. "What are you doing?" Her voice cracked, thin and terrible. "What are you doing to my child?" Dosso straightened, and the heat fell away from Demophoon like a cloak slipping from shoulders. The child woke and began to cry, a thin wail that was all confusion and cold. "I am saving him," Dosso said, and her voice was no longer the dry rasp of an old woman, but something else, something vast and still as the earth before the first seed was sown. "I am making him deathless." Metanera's breath came in shallow gasps. "You are burning him." You are Jay. She stumbled forward, arms outstretched, and Dosso stepped back, the child cradled against her chest. I am not, Dosso said, and there was a weight in her words that pressed against the walls, against the roof beams, against the air itself. I am undoing death. I am stripping away the weakness that kills you year by year, until there is nothing left but bone and memory. I would have finished. I would have given him to you whole and bright, and he would have walked through centuries as easily as you walk through a day. But you have interrupted, and the thread is broken. Metanera fell to her knees, her hands reaching, and Dosso set the child in her arms. Demophoon's cries softened as his mother held him, but Metanera's face was still ashen, her eyes wide with the terror of one who has looked into something too large to comprehend. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Dosovje, Demeter of Gj." Let the last pretense fall away. The veil dissolved like mist, and the worn cloak of age slid from her shoulders, and the fire on the hearth leapt up as if in recognition. Light filled the hall, not the light of flame, but the light of harvest sun on wheat, golden and endless, and the air smelled suddenly of threshed grain and honey, and the rich dark loam turned by the plough. She stood before them as herself, tall and grave and radiant, her hair the colour of ripe barley, her eyes deep as the furrows where seed is planted and waits. The mortal shape was gone, and in its place was the goddess, robed in sorrow and majesty, and her voice when she spoke was the voice that commands the seasons. "I am Demeter," she said. "I am she who makes the grain rise and the earth give forth its fruit. I am the mother who has lost her daughter to the Lord of the Dead, and I have wandered your world seeking solace." She looked down at Metanera, and her gaze was not unkind, but it was unyielding. "I would have made your son imperishable, a wonder among mortals, a hero whose name would outlast bronze. But you feared, and in your fear you broke the right. He will grow now as other men grow, Jay strong, perhaps, and long-lived, but not deathless. He will die." Metanera clutched Demophoon tighter, her tears falling onto his head, and she could not speak. Demeter turned, and her gaze swept the hall, where Celeus and his daughters had come running at the sound of their mother's cry and now stood frozen, staring at the radiance that filled their home. "But I will not leave you empty-handed," she said. "Build me a temple, here in Eleusis, on the hill above the Rarian plain. Let it be wide and strong, with a hall at its heart where my mysteries may be kept. I will teach you rites that ease the passage between light and shadow, that bind the living to the dead, and the dead to the living, and those who are initiated will carry in their hearts a promise that the furrow is not the end." Her voice softened, but the command in it remained, bright as bronze. "Do this, and I will bless your fields. Do this, and when my daughter returns to Mevijay, if she returns, I will remember your hospitality." Celeus, who was a man of authority and not easily unmanned, found his voice. "We will build it, lady. We will build it as you command, and we will honour you all our days." Demeter inclined her head. "Then let it be so." She stepped past them, and the light moved with her, and when she crossed the threshold into the courtyard, the fig tree bent as if in a wind, though the air was still. She did not look back. Behind her, Metanera wept and held her son, and Iambe stood in the shadows, silent for once, her eyes bright with something that might have been wonder or might have been fear. The temple rose on the hill through the long weeks that followed, stone on stone, timber lashed with rope and sealed with pitch. The men of Eleusis worked in shifts, and the women brought water and bread, and the children gathered wildflowers to lay at the foundation, small bright offerings that wilted in the sun and were replaced the next day. Demeter watched from a distance, seated on a rock where the wind smelled of time and the sea. She did not speak to them again. She did not need to. The work itself was a language, a call and response that needed no herald, and when the walls were complete and the roof was thatched and the great hall, the telesterion, stood shadowed and waiting, she entered and stood in its centre and felt the earth beneath her feet hum with recognition. Here, she thought, here I will plant the seed of remembrance. Here I will teach them to wait, as I wait, for the return of what has been taken. But the waiting was long, and the earth grew colder, and outside the temple walls the fields lay fallow and the barley did not stir, and men looked at the sky and wondered when the rain would come, and if it would come at all. Winter came without warning, without the courtesy of autumn's slow undressing. One day the fields held the gold of late harvest, and the next they were grey, stripped bare as bone, and the soil hardened like a face set against pleading. The rain that should have softened the earth in preparation for winter wheat did not fall. The clouds moved across the sky like empty vessels, and the wind that blew from the north carried no moisture, only the smell of dust and distance. In Eleusis the farmers walked their furrows and found the ground unyielding. Seed scattered on such earth lay exposed, food for crows and mice, and what little took root withered within days, pale threads that never thickened. The barley that had filled the storage jars from seasons past began to dwindle, measured carefully now, and the women ground less flour each morning and the bread grew thinner. Children who had run through the streets with the heedless energy of the well-fed moved more slowly, their eyes too large in their faces, and the old began to speak of years long past when the earth had withheld its gifts and men had learned the taste of hunger. It was the same in Attica and in Boeotia and in the valleys of Thessaly where the grain should have stood thick as a forest. It was the same on the islands where the terraced fields clung to hillsides and caught what rain the clouds deigned to release, and it was the same in the rich plains of Argos where the soil was deep and black and had never, in living memory, refused the plough. Everywhere the earth held its breath, and the silence was the silence of a body that will not yield, that has turned inward and locked its gates. Men made offerings at the altars. They slaughtered goats and poured wine into libation cups and burned the thigh bones wrapped in fat, sending smoke up to Olympus in thin grey columns that dissipated before they reached the clouds. The smoke smelled of desperation, and the gods, who knew the language of sacrifice as a musician knows the notes of a lyre, understood that this was not gratitude but barter, not praise but pleading. On Olympus, Zeus sat in his high hall and felt the thinness of it. The savour that rose from mortal fires had always been a current beneath the days, constant as breath, and now it faltered. Feasts were fewer. The herds that men led to the altars were scrawnier, chosen not from abundance but from necessity, and the prayers that accompanied them had lost the easiness of plenty and taken on the edge of fear. Hera, seated beside him with her sceptre across her knees, watched her husband with the cool patience of one who has waited out many storms. "The earth does not yield," she said. "Your daughter's grief sits in Eleusis and withholds the harvest. Men are beginning to starve, and the smoke of their altars grows thin. How long will you let her sulk?" Zeus looked at her, and his face was unreadable, neither angry nor amused. "It is not sulking, it is power. She holds the seasons in her hand, and she has closed her fist." "Then open it," Hera said. "Send someone to reason with her. Send Athene of DJ. She is wise, and she is a daughter. Or send Apollo. He is eloquent, and his tongue can turn stone to water. Even Hermes might coax her if he tried. Zeus considered. He had sent emissaries already, though Hera did not know it. Athena had gone to Eleusis and stood at the threshold of the new temple, and Demeter had not answered her call. Artemis, who walked wild places and understood the kinship of mothers and daughters, had spoken honeyed words through the door, and Demeter's silence had been answer enough. Hephaestus had offered gifts, DJ bronze vessels worked with scenes of wheat and grape, tokens of craft and reverence, and Demeter had let them lie untouched on the temple step. She would not be moved by words, nor by gifts, nor by the authority of Olympus. She would be moved only by the return of what had been taken, and Zeus knew this as he knew the weight of his own thunderbolt. But there were balances to maintain. Hades was his brother, lord of a realm as vast as the sky, and the dead were his portion as the living were Zeus's. To demand that Hades yield his queen entirely would be to overturn the order that held the cosmos together, to say that one realm mattered more than another, that the earth's hunger outweighed the underworld's right. It was a question not of justice but of proportion, and Zeus, who was many things but not indifferent to the structure that bore his throne, sought a middle way. He rose, and the hall grew quiet. The gods who sat in council, Poseidon with his trident, Hephaestus with his hammer, Aphrodite with her hands folded like lilies, watched and waited. "I will send Hermes," Zeus said. "He will go to the house of Hades and deliver my word. Let the maiden return. Let Persephone rise to the light, that her mother may cease her mourning, and the earth may bear fruit again. If Hades honours this command, the altars will fill once more, and the balance will hold." Poseidon, who understood the currents that ran beneath surfaces, spoke from his seat by the eastern pillar. "And if he has already bound her? If she has eaten of his table, drunk of his cup? The laws that govern the dead are not the laws of the living. What is tasted below cannot be untasted." Zeus's gaze was steady. "Then we will deal with what is, not with what we wish. But let the attempt be made. Let Hermes descend and speak, and let Hades know that Olympus requires an answer." He turned to Hermes, who stood near the doorway with the light easy on his shoulders, his caduceus in hand, his sandals already half-winged with redness. "Go," Zeus said. "Go swiftly and speak clearly. Tell my brother that the earth above is dying, and that the gods require the maiden's release. Bring her back if she will come, and bring word of all that passes below." Hermes inclined his head, and the motion was a kind of flight even before he moved. "I will go," he said, and his voice was quick and bright. A coin flipped and caught. "I will bring your word, and I will bring her back, Vuasondi, if the way is open." Then he was gone, a flicker of gold and shadow, and the hall was empty of his presence as a cup is empty of wine. The descent was not a journey in the way mortals understand journeys, a passage from one place to another across measurable ground. It was a folding, a step taken at an angle to the world, and when Hermes crossed the threshold between light and shadow, he felt the air change, growing cooler and heavier, tasting of stone and the sweetness of decay. The path led downward, not steeply but inevitably, and the walls on either side were neither rock nor earth but something older, something that had been there before the first mountain rose and would remain after the last one fell. He passed through the shadowed gates of Hades, through the fields of asphodel where the shades of the dead moved like mist, their faces turned inward, their voices thin as the wind through reeds. They did not notice him. Hermes, who guided souls on their final crossing, was familiar to them, neither feared nor welcomed, simply known. He moved among them as a shepherd moves among sheep, his presence a confirmation that the way was real, that the crossing had been made. At the heart of the underworld stood the palace of Hades, its walls the colour of tarnished silver, its roof lost in shadow. No smoke rose from its chimneys, no light burned in its windows, yet it was not dark. A sourceless illumination filled the halls, cold and even, like the light of stars reflected in still water. Hermes crossed the threshold and found himself in the great hall, where the Lord and Lady of the Dead sat enthroned. Hades looked as he had always looked, austere and still, his face neither young nor old, his eyes the grey of winter sky before snow. He wore no crown, but authority sat on him like a cloak, and when he turned his gaze on Hermes, it is without surprise, as if he had known the messenger would come and had been waiting with the patience of one who counted time in ages rather than days. Beside him, in a chair of black wood inlaid with silver, sat Persephone. Hermes had expected to find her diminished, perhaps, or subdued, a pale shadow of the maiden who had danced in meadows and woven crowns of violets. But the woman who looked back at him was neither pale nor subdued. She was changed, as water is changed when it passes from stream to sea, gaining depth and salt and a different kind of light. Her hair was still dark as earth after rain, but it was bound now in a manner that spoke of station rather than play, coiled and pinned with silver combs. Her dress was the colour of midnight, plain and unadorned, and around her shoulders lay a mantle that shimmered faintly, woven from threads that might have been spun from starlight or shadow, or something in between. She met Hermes's eyes, and in hers was neither plea nor reproach, only a stillness that unnerved him more than tears would have. "Hermes Psychopompos," Hades said, his voice low and even, the voice of one who has no need to raise it. "You come with a message." "I do," Hermes replied, and he spoke the words Zeus had given him, neither embellishing nor softening. "The earth above is dying. Demeter withholds the harvest, and men starve. The gods receive no sacrifice, and the altars grow cold. Zeus, Lord of Olympus, commands that Persephone return to the light, that her mother's grief may end and the seasons turn once more." Hades listened without expression. When Hermes finished, the silence stretched, filling the hall like water filling a cup, slow and deliberate. Then Hades looked at Persephone, and something passed between them, a flicker of understanding that needed no words. "She may go," Hades said. "I do not hold her against her will. I have never held her so. If she wishes to return to the world above, I will not prevent it." Persephone rose. She moved with the deliberate grace of one who has learned to carry weight without stumbling, and when she spoke her voice was clear and calm, neither eager nor reluctant. "I will go," she said. "I will return to my mother, and I will walk once more in the fields where flowers grow." She paused, and the pause was weighted, a breath taken before a leap. "But I have eaten here. Not the feast set before me, not the meat and bread and wine that honour a guest. I refused those. But I was hungry, and the hunger of this place is a particular kind of hunger, sharp and patient. And so I took a seed, DJ, one small seed from the pomegranate tree that grows in the garden at the edge of the hall. I ate it, and it was sweet, and it was bitter, and it was mine." Hermes felt the words settle like stones in his chest. Hades did not move, but his gaze shifted to Persephone, and in it was something that might have been sorrow, or might have been satisfaction, or both braided together like threads in a cord. "Then the law holds," Hades said quietly. "She who eats in the realm of the dead is bound to it. She cannot leave entirely, not now, not ever. The seed is a tether, and it will draw her back. Hades considered, and the consideration was genuine, not a performance but a weighing. He was a god of absolutes. Death was final. The shades did not return, but he was also a god of law, and law required precision. Let it be thus. For a third of each year she will return here, in my house, as my queen. The remaining 2/3 she may walk above in the light beside her mother. This is the balance. Persephone met his gaze, and in hers was something complex, neither acceptance nor refusal, but a recognition of what was. She inclined her head, a gesture that was both acknowledgement and agreement, and when she turned to Hermes her face was composed. "I will abide by it," she said. "Take me to my mother." They rose through the shadowed way as dawn rises through mist, gradual and then sudden, and when they stepped into the light it was in a meadow not far from Eleusis, where the Rarian plain spread wide and empty, waiting for seed. The sky was the pale grey of early morning, and the air smelled of dew and the faint green promise of growth that lingers even in fallow ground. Demeter stood at the edge of the field, her back to them, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She wore no veil now, no disguise. She was herself entire, tall and terrible and beautiful, and the earth beneath her feet seemed to lean toward her, waiting for permission to wake. Hermes did not speak. He simply stood aside, and Persephone walked forward, her footsteps soft on the dry grass. And when she was close enough to touch, Demeter turned. For a moment neither moved. They stood like figures carved from stone, mother and daughter, and the air between them was thick with all that had been lost, and all that was found. Then Demeter reached out, and Persephone stepped into her arms, and the embrace was fierce and silent, a reunion that needed no witness and no words. Hermes, who had seen many things in his long service as the god's messenger, looked away. There were griefs too large for observation, joys too sharp for intrusion. He waited at the meadow's edge, his caduceus resting against his shoulder, until Demeter at last released her daughter and turned to him. "She has eaten," Demeter said, and it was not a question. "She has tasted the pomegranate," Hermes replied. "By the law below, she will return for a third of each year. The rest of the time she is yours." Demeter's face tightened, and for a moment the air grew cold, frost-bright and sharp. "A third of the year," she repeated, tasting the words, testing their weight. 2 parts in light and 1 in shadow. "It is the law," Hermes said gently. "It is the balance that Hades proposes, and Zeus will uphold it." Demeter looked at her daughter, and Persephone met her gaze steadily. "I chose it," Persephone said. "Not the taking of J, that was not my choice, but the seed, the eating of J that I chose. I was hungry, and I ate, and now I am bound, not entirely to one realm or the other, but to both. I will walk between, mother. I will go down when the time comes, and I will return when the time turns. It is how it will be." Demeter's hands tightened on her daughter's shoulders, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I would have kept you here forever," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I would have held the earth hostage until every last mortal starved, if it meant you would never leave my side again." "I know," Persephone said, "but the world is larger than our will, and the law is older than our grief. Let it be enough that I return. Let it be enough that the fields will flower again, and that we will walk them together." Demeter closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, something in her had shifted, not softened but settled, as a stone settles into the riverbed and lets the water pass over it. "Enough," she said quietly. "It will have to be enough." She turned to the field and she lifted her hands, and the gesture was a command and a blessing both. The earth stirred. It was not immediate, not a miracle of sudden abundance, but a loosening, a readiness. The soil that had been hard as bronze softened, and the seeds that had lain dormant beneath its surface felt the change and began to stir. Roots pushed downward, pale and questing, and the first green shoots split the ground, fragile and fierce, and the air smelled suddenly of rain and growth and the turning that men called spring. The farmers in the fields nearby looked up from their empty furrows and saw the change, and their faces, hard with hunger and fear, eased into something like wonder. The women who had rationed the last of the grain set down their measures and walked to their doorways, and they saw the green spreading across the plain like water, and they wept. In Eleusis, in the temple that had been built to Demeter's command, the priests and priestesses who tended the sacred fire felt the shift and knew that the goddess had returned her favour. The altars that had been cold began to warm, and the smoke of offerings rose once more, thin at first but thickening, carrying the scent of roasted meat and honey cakes and wine poured out in gratitude. Hermes, his task complete, bowed to Demeter and then to Persephone. "I will carry word to Olympus," he said. "The seasons will turn again, and the compact is sealed. May it hold." "It will hold," Demeter said, and her voice was iron beneath the softness. "Because I will hold it. And when the time comes for my daughter to descend, I will let her go. But the earth will remember. Every year when she leaves, the fields will sleep, and when she returns, they will wake. Let men remember too that the harvest is a gift, not a right, and that the turning depends on more than the plough." Hermes inclined his head, and then he was gone, a flicker of gold against the grey sky, and Demeter and Persephone stood alone in the field. Persephone looked down at the green shoots pushing through the soil, and she knelt and touched one with her fingertips gently, as one touches a newborn. "It begins again," she said. "It does," Demeter replied, "and it will end, and it will begin again, and so the wheel will turn. That is the law now, the law we have made between Isjeyu and I, and the dark lord below, and the sky above." Persephone rose, and she brushed the soil from her hands, and she looked at her mother with eyes that had seen shadow, and would see it again, and were not afraid. "Then let us walk while we can," she said. "Let us gather the flowers that bloom, and weave the crowns, and remember what it is to stand in the light." Demeter took her daughter's hand, and together they walked through the waking field, and behind them the earth unfurled like a banner, green and gold and rich with promise, and the farmers who watched from the edges whispered prayers of thanksgiving and wondered at the mercy of gods. On Olympus, Zeus received the news with neither triumph nor regret, only the quiet satisfaction of one who has steered a storm into calmer waters. The compromise would hold because it had to, because both realms required it, and because the cost was distributed evenly enough that neither side could claim unbearable loss. Demeter had her daughter for most of the year, and Hades had his queen for a portion. The living would eat, and the dead would keep their law. The balance was restored, but in the underworld, Hades sat alone in his silver hall, and the silence was deeper than before, because he had tasted something other than silence, and now he would wait, month by month, for its return. He did not speak of it. He did not rage or mourn. He simply waited, as the dead wait, with the patience of stone. And in the garden at the edge of his hall, the pomegranate tree that had yielded a single seed to a hungry queen stood shadowed and still, its fruit hanging heavy, red as blood, sweet as sorrow. a promise and a tether that would draw her back when the time turned and the earth above grew cold once more. Hecate came at twilight, drawn by the scent of reunion, as a hound is drawn by the scent of home. She found them in the meadow where the narcissus had once bloomed, where the earth had opened and swallowed light. Now the flowers were only half returned, shy and scattered, but they were enough. Persephone turned at the sound of footsteps, and when she saw the torchbearer she smiled. A small smile edged with shadow but real. "Hecate," she said, "you heard." "I always hear," Hecate replied. Her torches were unlit, held loose at her sides, but her eyes were bright in the gathering dusk. "I heard your cry when you were taken, and I hear your voice now, returned. The threshold has been crossed both ways, and you stand in the middle. That is no easy place." "No," Persephone agreed, "but it is mine." Hecate looked at Demeter, and something passed between them, an understanding forged in the long nights of searching, in the shared silence of those who know what it is to lose, and then, against all expectation, to find. "She will need a guide," Hecate said quietly. "When the time comes for her to go down again, she will need someone who knows the way, who can walk the boundary without flinching. I will be that guide, if you permit it." Demeter's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "I permit it. Guard her well, Hecate. Guard her as you would guard your own threshold." "I will," Hecate said, and the promise was iron. "She will not walk alone, neither in descent nor in return. I will be the lamp at the crossing, and she will always find the way." Persephone reached out and took Hecate's hand, and the torchbearer's fingers closed around hers warm and sure. "Thank you," Persephone said simply. Hecate smiled, and it was not a soft smile, but it was true. "The threshold is my place," she said. "And you, Cora, who is also queen, are the threshold itself now. We will walk it together." The three of them stood in the meadow as the last light faded, and the first stars appeared, cold and distant and unwavering, and the earth beneath their feet breathed softly, in and out, a rhythm as old as time and as patient as stone, and the compact was sealed not in words but in the quiet turning of the seasons, the endless exchange of light and shadow, loss and return, the seed planted and the seed rising again and again, world without end. The year turned, and with it the rhythm that would henceforth govern the earth. When summer deepened and the grain stood tall in the fields, ready for the sickle, Persephone looked toward the horizon and felt the pull like a thread drawn taut. The time had come. She walked with her mother to the edge of the Rarian plain, where the furrows were straight and deep, and the soil smelled of harvest and the promise of rest. "I must go," she said, and her voice was steady, neither eager nor reluctant, simply clear. Demeter did not answer immediately. She stood with her hand on her daughter's shoulder, feeling the warmth of living flesh, the pulse that beat beneath skin, and she let herself remember, as she would remember each year henceforth, what it was to hold and then to release. "I know," she said at last. "The seed calls you, and the law holds. Go then, walk with Hecate and let her torches light your way, and when the time turns again, come back to me." Hecate stepped forward from the shadow of the plane tree that marked the boundary of the field. Her torches were lit now, twin flames that burned without smoke, steady as stars. "Come, Cor," she said, and the old name was a tenderness and a recognition both. "The threshold waits, and I will walk it with you." Persephone embraced her mother, a long embrace that was both farewell and covenant, and then she turned and walked beside Hecate toward the place where the earth would open once more. As they went, the light around them dimmed, not with the coming of night, but with the slow withdrawal of summer's fullness, and the leaves on the trees began to yellow at their edges, and the flowers that had bloomed in bright profusion bowed their heads and let their petals fall. Demeter watched until they were out of sight, and then she turned back to the fields and knelt and pressed her palm against the soil. "Sleep," she whispered. "Sleep now and wait. She will return, and when she does, you will wake." And the earth, obedient, began its long rest. The first initiates came to Eleusis in the month of Bodromion, when the heat of summer had passed and the air carried the first coolness of autumn. They gathered in Athens, a crowd neither small nor vast, drawn from the city and the countryside, from the houses of the wealthy and the huts of labourers, men and women, young and old, slave and free. What united them was not station but readiness, a willingness to walk a road that promised no certainty save the walking itself. The heralds had called them weeks before, proclaiming the truce that would hold throughout the sacred days, a suspension of war and feuding so that the path to Eleusis might be safe for all who wished to tread it. They came with offerings, piglets purchased from the market, small squealing creatures that would be purified and then released or sacrificed, barley cakes wrapped in cloth, amphorae of wine stoppered with wax. They came with questions unspoken, carried like stones in the chest, questions about death and what lay beyond it, about the furrow that receives the body and whether anything rises. On the appointed day they walked to the sea. The shore at Phaleron was wide and stony, and the waves rolled in with the patient repetition of breath. The priests of Eleusis stood at the water's edge, robed in white, their faces grave and kind, and they gestured the initiates forward. One by one, clutching their piglets, the people waded into the surf. The water was cold, salt bright, and it stung the skin and cleared the head. They dipped themselves once and again, and the piglets struggled and bleated, and the priests murmured words too low to carry over the sound of the waves, words that were not commands but invitations, a calling in of those who had crossed the threshold. When they emerged, dripping and shivering, they were no longer entirely what they had been. The sea had taken something of not innocence, for the rite did not promise that but a certain heaviness, a crust of old sorrows and angers that clung like dust. They stood on the shore and let the wind dry their skin, and they looked at one another with eyes that were a little clearer, a little more willing to see. The procession began the next morning at dawn. They assembled at the Dipylon Gate, where the sacred way began its winding path from Athens to Eleusis, a distance of some 14 miles. The road was old, paved in places with stone, elsewhere bare earth worn smooth by countless feet. Along its length stood shrines and markers, an altar to Aphrodite, a herm at the crossroads, a grove sacred to the hero who had once walked this way and never returned. The initiates moved in a loose column, some walking in pairs, others alone, and at intervals the priests called out the refrain that would accompany them all the way to the sanctuary. Iacchus, Io, Iacchus. The name rang out, bright and jubilant, a cry that was neither prayer nor command but celebration, the acknowledgement of a presence that moved among them, unseen but felt. Iacchus DJ, spirit of the procession, demon of the torch and the road, companion to those who walked between light and shadow. Some said he was Dionysus by another name, others that he was the son of Demeter, a brother to Persephone. It did not matter. What mattered was the voice lifted in unison, the shared rhythm of feet on stone, the sense that they moved not as solitary souls but as a current, a river flowing toward the sea. They carried branches of myrtle, and the leaves were dark and glossy, and they smelled faintly bitter, clean. The women wore saffron ribbons in their hair, and the men had crowns of woven willow, and the children, too young to be initiated but old enough to walk, darted between the adults like swallows, their laughter high and brief. As the sun climbed and the day grew warm, the priest distributed water and bread, and the column paused at wells and springs to drink and rest. At midday they reached the bridge over the Kephissos, and there the tone changed. Masked figures waited on the bridge, laughing and jeering, calling out insults and obscenities, mocking the initiates with coarse humour and ribald songs. It was the custom, old as the rite itself, a reminder that the sacred and the profane were not opposites but neighbours. That laughter could be as holy as silence, that the body and its appetites were part of the whole and not to be despised. The initiates grinned, some blushing, some shouting back in kind, and the tension that had gathered on the long walk loosened, and they crossed the bridge lighter than before. By evening they reached Eleusis. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the plain, and the temple stood on its hill like a promise kept. The initiates did not enter immediately. They gathered instead at the well Voidgie Kalicharon, the place of the beautiful dance Viadje, and they circled it, singing and clapping, their voices weaving together in a pattern older than memory. The song had no words that could be written, only sounds that rose and fell, a keening that was half joy and half mourning, and as they sang the first stars appeared, cold and distant, and the torches were lit. Night was the time of the rite, and night was the realm where words faltered, and only presence spoke. The initiates entered the temple precinct in silence now, their torches held aloft, and the light flickered on the stones and turned faces into masks familiar and strange. They passed through the outer courtyard, where incense burned in bronze bowls and the air was thick with myrrh and cedar, and they came at last to the Telesterion, the great hall where the mysteries would be revealed. It was larger than any hall most of them had ever seen, capable of holding thousands, its roof supported by columns that rose like trees in a sacred grove. There were no windows. The only light came from the torches the priests carried, and from a single opening high above, a shaft that led down into the Anacteron, the inner chamber at the heart of the building, the place that only the Hierophant and his attendants might enter. The initiates sat on the stone benches that ringed the hall, tier upon tier, and they set their torches in the holders provided, and the light pooled and shimmered, turning the space into something neither entirely earthly nor entirely otherwise. They waited, and the waiting itself was part of the rite, a suspension of ordinary time, a pause in which breath deepened and the clamour of thought grew still. Then the Hierophant emerged from the Anacteron. He was an old man, robed in purple, his face shadowed by a veil of fine linen, and his voice when he spoke was low and resonant, a voice that seemed to rise not from his throat but from the stone beneath their feet. "You have come to the threshold," he said. "You have walked the road, and you have purified yourselves in the sea, and you have crossed the bridge where laughter strips away pretense. Now you stand at the gate, and the gate is open. What you will see here is not a riddle to be solved, nor a doctrine to be learned. It is a showing and a saying and a thing carried dudromena, deiknimena, legomena. Watch and hear and hold what is given." He withdrew into the Anacteron, and the silence that followed was absolute. A silence so deep that the initiates could hear their own heartbeats, the rush of blood in their ears, the small sounds of cloth shifting and breath drawn. Then, from within the inner chamber, light began to spill. It was not the light of torches. It was brighter, steadier, the light of a fire contained and focused, and it poured out through the opening above the anactron and filled the telesterion with a radiance that made the torches seem pale by comparison. The initiates shielded their eyes, then lowered their hands and looked, and what they saw was not easily named, for it was not a spectacle in the way mortals understood spectacles, not a drama performed by actors on a stage. It was grain, a single stalk of wheat, held aloft by the Hierophant, golden and whole, its head heavy with seed. He stood in the centre of the light, silent, and the initiates looked at the stalk and saw in it everything they had ever planted and waited for, every furrow they had watched and prayed over, every harvest they had gathered and every winter they had endured. They saw the patience of seed buried in darkness, the quiet faith that the earth would not forget, that what was planted would rise. They saw the cycle, life, death, return. They saw the mother and the daughter, the search and the reunion, the loss that was not the end but the pause before the turning. The Hierophant spoke a single word, or perhaps it was a name, or perhaps it was older than names, a sound that held within it the promise of all that grows. The initiates heard it, and they wept, not with sorrow, but with something larger, a recognition that bypassed thought, and lodged itself in the body, in the marrow of the bone and the chamber of the heart. Then the light dimmed, and the Hierophant withdrew, and the anacteron was closed once more. Afterward they were given the kykion, the same drink Demeter had accepted in the house of Celeus, barley water stirred with pennyroyal, simple and clean, tasting of earth and the green things that grow in shade. They drank from a common cup, passing it hand to hand, and the gesture was a sealing, a shared covenant that what they had witnessed would not be spoken to those who had not walked the road. Not because it was forbidden in the way laws forbid, but because it could not be spoken, because words would only diminish it, turn mystery into explanation, and leave nothing but ash. They filed out of the telesterion as dawn touched the sky, pale and tentative, and the world they returned to was the same world they had left. Yet they moved through it differently now. The stone beneath their feet felt more solid, the air more generous, and when they looked at one another they saw not strangers but companions, bound by the walk and the waiting, by the light and the grain, and the cup passed in silence. Triptolemus came to the temple in the days that followed, summoned by a dream or a vision, or simply by the knowledge that his time had come. He was the eldest son of Celeus, and he'd been a child when Demeter first walked in his father's house, too young to remember clearly, but old enough to have heard the stories. Now he was a man, lean and sun-darkened, his hands calloused from the plough, and he knelt before the goddess where she stood in the temple courtyard. "You called me," he said, and it was both question and acknowledgement. Demeter looked at him, and her gaze was the gaze of one who measures not height or strength, but readiness. "I did," she said. "I have taught your people the rites that ease the passage between light and shadow, and they will keep them, year by year, a lamp against the dark. But there are lands beyond Eleusis, places where the plough is still unknown, where men eat acorns and roots and know nothing of the patience of seed. You will carry the gift to them." She led him to the Rarian plain, where a chariot waited. It was unlike any chariot mortals made, light as wicker, strong as bronze, its frame carved from wood that had never grown in any forest men could name. Yoked to it were two serpents, great coiling creatures whose scales shimmered green and gold, whose eyes were ancient and calm. They did not hiss or strike, they simply waited, patient as the earth itself. Triptolemus stared, and fear and wonder warred in his chest. "I am no hero," he said quietly. "I am a farmer." "Yes," Demeter replied, "that is why I chose you." She gave him a sack of grain, barley and wheat mingled, seed that had been blessed and would not fail even in poor soil, even in the hands of those who did not yet understand its worth. "Go to the north, where the Scythians wander, and to the west, where the Iberians plant vines but no wheat. Go to the islands where the soil is thin and the people hungry. Show them the furrow and the seed, the turning of the earth and the waiting. Tell them that the goddess gives this freely, and that the harvest is the bond between heaven and earth, between life and the sustaining of life." Triptolemus took the sack, and he climbed into the chariot, and the serpents stirred, lifting their heads, and the wheels turned without sound. The chariot rose, DJ, not into the sky, for it was not a thing of air, but along the earth, skimming the surface like a stone skipped across water, swift and sure. Demeter watched him go, a bright speck against the horizon, and she felt a satisfaction that was neither pride nor relief but simply completion, the closing of a circle that had begun in grief and ended in gift. The seasons turned. Persephone returned in the spring, stepping out of shadow into light at the place where the narcissus bloomed once more, and Demeter met her there, and the fields woke. Green spread across the Rarian plain like water pouring from a jar, and the barley stood thick, and the wheat bent under its own abundance, and men sang as they swung the sickle, and women ground the flour and baked the bread, and children grew strong on the fruit of the earth. When autumn came, Persephone left again, walking with Hecate down the shadowed path, and the leaves fell and the fields slept, and Demeter withdrew into her temple and waited, as she would wait every year, for the turning that would bring her daughter back. The rite at Eleusis became a fixture of the year, as constant as the solstice, as necessary as rain. Each autumn, when the grain had been gathered and the land prepared for winter, the initiates walked the sacred way, and the torches were lit, and the mysteries were shown. Mothers brought their daughters, fathers their sons, and the old came to be reminded and the young to learn, and no one who walked the road and sat in the telesterion and drank the kykeon left unchanged. They did not speak of what they had seen, but they carried it, and it shaped the way they lived. They planted seed with a different kind of patience, knowing that what went into the dark would rise. They buried their dead with less fear, trusting that the furrow was not an ending but a pause, a waiting for the season that would come. They looked at the world Vasji, at the wheat and the barley, at the turning of the year, at the mother who let go and the daughter who returned G, and they saw in it a promise that suffering was not the last word, that the seed held within it the shape of the harvest. That light would always answer shadow if one waited long enough. Demeter stood on the hill above Eleusis as evening came, the sky pale gold fading to violet, and she watched the smoke rise from the hearths in the town below. It was a small smoke, nothing like the great columns that had once risen from the altars of sacrifice, but it was enough. The people were fed, and the earth was generous, and the compact held. Persephone would return when winter passed, and they would walk together through the meadows, and the flowers would lift their faces to the sun, and the world would remember how to be young. And when the time came for parting, Demeter would let her go, not easily but willingly, because the law was fair and the balance mattered, and because the love that held was stronger than the love that clung. She thought of the child Demophoon, who had not been made deathless but who had grown strong and wise, a man honoured in Eleusis, a keeper of the rights she had given. She thought of Iambe, long since gone to the shadowed fields, whose laughter had been a thread of light in the darkest days. She thought of Triptolemus, whom she had sent across the world, and she wondered how many fields now held grain that had come from the seed she gave. How many people ate bread who had once known only hunger? The mysteries were hers, but they belonged now to the people too. A shared treasure, a lamp passed from hand to hand. She had not healed the wound. Why wounds of that depth do not heal. They only scarved, yes. But she had made of it something useful. A door where there had been only wall. A path where there had been only wilderness. The stars appeared, one by one, and the air grew cool, and Demeter drew her mantle closer and turned back toward the temple. Inside the lamps were lit, and the priestesses were singing, a low melody that threaded through the halls like water through stone, and she listened and let it carry her, and she was content. Outside the earth slept, patient and deep, dreaming of spring.